Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. We're going to come back to our value gradations page and add another one today. Now most of the gradations we've been doing so far we've just put right onto the sketchbook paper that's part of our sketchbooks, and it's okay. I mean, we can get away with doing a little pen and ink work and with some graphite work and even some charcoal, but it's fairly low quality paper, great for concepting and stuff. But when we work with our watercolors, we're going to have to get something that's a little bit higher quality. Watercolors would just make a huge mess of this really thin paper. So to do that, go to your folder, and you should have a couple of pieces of sort of a really thick, heavy gauge watercolor paper. It's actually not paper in the same way that your sketchbook paper is paper, in that this is a cotton-based paper, where your sketchbook is tree pulp. It's also a much heavier duty paper, and it can sort of stand up to the lots of water that we'll be using to sort of mix our inks, mix our colors on this stuff. You likely won't need the entire sheet. Use your guide to sort of block off maybe 2 columns on one side. There's a really good chance that you might goof the first one. So let's do 2 of them. Now, a couple other materials that you're going to need to make this all work is you'll have to fish out your watercolor kit. The watercolor kit that we've got is it's got a full range of colors, most importantly the primaries, but we're going to make use of the black. Brushes that we're going to use here, the brush that comes in this kit is a really fine pointed brush. But let's set that aside. We're not going to use that for today's work. What we really need to do is find some of these wet media brushes in your kit. Most of you guys have these green ones or one of these black ones. The same basic idea here. They're a real soft, natural fiber. It holds a lot of water. If you have a plastic sleeve on the outside of your brush, that's there just to protect these really soft bristles. It's not a bad idea to put that back on when we're all done. It's very different than our utility brushes. Don't mistake the two. Your utility brushes are sort of stiff, maybe plasticky. These bristles are very soft. You're also going to need a dish of water and a couple of paper towels. You could use the cloth or the rag that's in your art kit, but paper towels are a little bit more absorbent than that. I also like to get these set up in a way so that I'm not drip dropping ink all over my painting. So if I'm setting up to do some ink paintings right here, I want to keep my water up on top, my paints to the side, and then my dabbing cloth somewhere nearby. This way, as I'm sort of dipping and bringing ink over to my drawing, I can always stop on the dabbing cloth in case I'm concerned that it might drip. Now, watercolor is going to sort of stress your patience a little bit. You have to wait for it. You can't force it, especially coming right off of, say, doing some graphite or charcoal that you can work and work and work and work. Watercolor is a bit more finicky. You put it down and you have to leave it. And so I'm going to teach you guys 2 techniques here to hopefully help you predict a little bit more about what's coming. I'll also show you how to lift color and water up off of your watercolor page here to try to predict a little bit more about what's going to happen. The watercolors that we use are, they come in these cakes over here. They're sort of a semi-moist cake. And all you do is add water, and honestly you're painting mostly with water when you do watercolor, and so these last a long time. We're not going to use anywhere near the entire thing. So keep your water handy. I'm going to dab off just a little bit and demonstrate the first technique here on the left, which would be a wet into wet technique. I'm going to pre-wet each one of these squares, which you're not going to see very much, but basically I'm just sort of laying down a bit of water where I know that I'm going to be doing some ink brushing. This water sort of sets a boundary for where my inks will flow. Now that I've got my squares pre-wet, I'll start by bringing in my first round of ink, and you can see how it just immediately starts to flow out toward the edges. And once I've laid my inks in, I'm committed. No more messing with it. Okay, you're going to feel tempted to want to work back into these and modify it and add more here and add more there. Don't do it. Just leave it. I promise you it'll change significantly. Right now it looks really stark and sort of badly mixed, but just let it sit 15-20 minutes and we'll come back and take a look. Now I'm going to work up these ones on this side, and instead of working wet into wet, I'm just going to work wet ink right down into these spaces and see if I can get something similar. I'm also going to demonstrate a technique called lifting. So I'm going to lay all my inks down and then lift each one of them off so that I have a more immediate picture of what I've accomplished. So the longer I let these inks sit on the page, the more they'll be soaked up into the paper. So I'm going to take a nice clean dry rag and start at the lightest area and dab up to the top. That technique of working wet onto dry and then lifting is sort of, it gives you a little bit more immediate results. I can sort of see a little bit more of what I'm doing, but I kind of like working wet into wet. It's a little bit softer, it's a little bit gentler, it allows the kind of paint to flow a bit more. So I'm going to let that sit, come back in a few minutes and show you what it looks like dry. So after these have had a chance to dry, I'll take a quick look at how they dried down. The one that I dabbed off has a bit more control. These two values appear pretty close, but otherwise the stepping is okay. Looks like I got these two values flipped, but more or less I got the same effect. Now some of the interesting things I think to pay attention to is if you leave the wet on wet puddles to dry on their own, they develop a really nice kind of hard edge, or kind of like a reticulated edge, and the drybacks are really interesting. There's a lot of texture and interesting sort of qualities to that. Each one of those you could take advantage of as you're using them later on in your drawings. What we'll do is find at least one of these that you're happy with. If you didn't get one that came out reasonably well, go ahead and give it another try. This is the sort of thing where trying it over and over again is only going to improve your ability to predict, and not goof up with kind of strange dry lines and overworking it. One of the kind of easiest mistakes to make working with watercolors and brush and ink is to overwork it. It takes a certain amount of patience to just lay the ink down and then just leave it and trust that you'll come back later and it will work out okay. Once you do get a 5-step gradation that you're reasonably happy with, go ahead and cut it from whatever page it happens to be on, and we'll add it to our page of gradations. You could add it to this page using a simple glue stick and giving it a pretty good glue stick on the back. Since this paper is a little thick, I'm going to make use of the PVA glue that's in our kit and the utility brush. Just a point here, never stick a wet media brush with this big kind of soft mop, the sable hair, natural sable hair bristles, into your PVA glue. You'll never really get it brushed out of that. Use your cheaper utility brush for that kind of work. Alright guys, I'll catch up with you in the studio.